Hello. Today I'm going to tell you a story about the Byzantine Empire and its rulers. Immerse yourselves in the story and drift off to sleep in peace in the great city on the Bosporus, where Europe, Eurasia, and Asia add across a narrow strip of shimmering water. There existed for more than 1,000 years a civilization called itself Roman, but become something far more extraordinary. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome, the queen of cities, was the beating heart of the Byzantine that outlasted the fall of Rome in the West by nearly a millennium and shaped the course of European and Near Eastern history in ways that are still felt today. At its center, enthroned in gold and purple, amid the burning of sacred incense and the chanting of court ceremonial, sat the Byzantine Emperor, the Basileus, the autocrat of the Romans, the equal of the apostles. And beside him, more often than history chosen to remember, stood his empress. The Byzantine imperial system was one of the most elaborate political and ceremonial constructions in human history. The emperor was not merely a king. He was, in the theological understanding of the Byzantine world, God representative on earth, the earthly mirror of the divine monarchy of Christ in heaven. His person was sacred. His palace, the great palace of Constantinople, was a city within a city, encompassing hundreds of rooms, ceremonial halls of breathtaking luxury, chapels decorated in gold mosaic, gardens, fallow grounds, and the private apartments where the lives of emperors and empresses unfolded behind walls of protocol and intrigue. The sacred purple of imperial robes, derived from the costly dye of the murex shellfish, was so closely identified with imperial legitimacy that children born to a reigning emperor in the special porphyry-lined birding chamber of the palace were called porphyrogenitus, born in the purple. The color itself was a claim to power. Yet for all its ceremonial grandeur, the Byzantine throne was one of the most precarious seats in the medieval world. Of the roughly 90 emperors who ruled in Constantinople between the founding of the city in 330 and its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 143, fewer than half died peacefully in their beds as reigning monarchs. The rest were deposed, blinded, exiled, strangled, poisoned, or killed in battle. The palace was as dangerous as it was magnificent. Conspiracies formed in antechambers. Factions of the military, the church, the aristocracy, and populace of Constantinople. The volatile, passionate citizens who packed the hippodrome to watch chariot races, and sometimes to demand the head of an unpopular emperor, could all tip the balance of power with terrifying speed. In this world, the empress was not a passive ornament. She was a political actor, sometimes crucial one, and in a remarkable number of cases, a sovereign in her own right. This is the story of the Byzantine emperors and the women who ruled beside them. It is a story of extraordinary power and extraordinary vulnerability, of love and dynastic calculation, of women who navigated the most dangerous political environment in the medieval world with intelligence, courage, and sometimes ruthlessness. It is also a story about what it meant to hold power in a civilization that believed the emperors descended directly from God, and what happened when that authority was challenged, shared, or seized by someone the rulebook had never anticipated. Part 2: Constantine and the birth of an empire. Helena, the first imperial mother. The story of Byzantine imperial power begin man who did not set out to found a new civilization, but who did so nonetheless. Constantine I, later called Constantine the Great, was a Roman military commander who fought his way to sole control of the Roman Empire through a series of bloody civil wars between 306 and 324 CE. His victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, under what he described as a Christian sign seen in the sky, would change the course of Western history. Constantine's conversion to Christianity, or at least his adoption of Christianity as the favored religion of the Roman state, transformed what had been a persecuted minority faith into the official religion of the greatest empire in the Western world, and his decision to found a new capital on the site of the city of Byzantine, at the strategic crossing point between Europe and Asia, gave the Eastern Roman Empire its permanent home. Beside Constantine in the story of Christian Rome stands his mother, Helena. She was not born to imperial life. Ancient sources suggest she was of humble origin, possibly the daughter of an innkeeper, and she was the wife or the long-term companion of Constantius Clarus, Constantine's father, before he set her aside for a more politically advantageous marriage. This dismissal might have ended her historical significance entirely. Instead, when her son rose to power, Helena rose with him. Constantine elevated his mother to the rank of Augusta, Empress, and gave her resources, authority, and prestige that she used with remarkable effect. Helena is best known to history for her pilgrimage to the Holy Land, undertaken when she was already in her 70s, around the year 326 CE. The journey was remarkable for its scope and its consequences. Helena oversaw the construction of churches at the sites of Christ's birth in Bethlehem and Ascension on the Mount of Olives. She is credited, though the historical details are complex and contested, with the discovery of the true cross, the wooden cross on which Jesus was believed to have been crucified, found buried beneath the Pan Temple in Jerusalem. Whether or not the relic was authentic, its significance is immediate. Helena's pilgrimage established the template for Christian imperial piety. The Empress, as protector of the faith, builder of holy places, finder of sacred objects. For centuries after her death, Byzantine empresses would measure themselves against her example. Constantine himself left an ambiguous legacy in terms of the women in his life. His relationships were shaped by the brutal logic of Roman dynastic politics. His wife Fausta, daughter of the Emperor Maximian and mother of three of his sons, was executed in 2026 CE on Constantine's orders, allegedly implicated in a conspiracy involving his eldest son Crispus, who was also put to death in the same year. The full truth of what happened has never been recovered from the surviving sources, which are fragmentary and often contradictory. What is clear is that within the imperial family, the gap between ceremonial elevation and personal danger was always narrow. The purple robe and the executioner's order could come from the same hand. Nevertheless, what Constantine created endured. The city he built on the Bosphorus would stand as the capital of a Christian empire for more than 1100 years. The institutions he established, the Christian state, the sacred character of the imperial person, the fusion of Roman law and administration with Greek culture and Christian theology, would define Byzantine civilization for its entire history. When we speak of Byzantine emperors and their consorts, we speak of a tradition that Constantine's reign set in motion, a tradition of power and piety, ceremony and violence, that play out more than 1,000 years, and dozens of imperial couples, each navigating the treacherous waters of the most durable monarchy of the medieval world. End Part 3. Leodora, the actress, and Justinian, a stayer, the most famous imperial couple. If one had to choose a single imperial couple to represent the Byzantine world at the height of creativity and drama, the voice would certainly fall on Justinian I and his empress, Theodora. Their partnership, which lasted from their marriage around 523 CEE until Theodora's death in 548, produced some of the most consequential achievements in the history of late antiquity, and their personal story was one of the most improbable in the annals of power. Justinian was born around 482 CE in a Latin-speaking region of the Balkans, probably in what is now North Macedonia. His uncle Justin, a Macedonian peasant who had risen through the ranks of the Byzantine army to become emperor, brought the young Justinian to Constantinople and gave him education, connections, and eventual succession that his own birth could never have provided. Justinian was intellectually formidable, hard-working, deep-learned theology, law, administration, driven by a vision of restoring the old Roman Empire to its full territorial extent. He was also, in the judgment of his contemporaries, somewhat humorless and obsessive, a man who reportedly slept very little and spent his nights reading and dictating correspondence. His great historian, Procopius, who admired and feared him in roughly equal measure, described him as a man who was in many ways both more and less than human. Theodora was something else entirely. Born around 500 CE, she was the daughter of a bearkeeper employed, one of the factions of the Hippodrome, the great stadium where chariot races and public entertainments defined the social life of Constantinople. When her father died, her mother remarried, and the children were thrust into the performing arts, the only profession available to women of theatrical class. Theodora became an actress and mime performer, occupations that in Byzantine society carried enormous social stigma, associated as they were with sexual availability and moral disrepute. Procopius, in his scandalous and historically unreliable secret history wrote about Theodora's early life with lurid detail and obvious hostility. His account must be read with great caution. What is beyond dispute is that Theodora had left the theatrical profession. By the time she met Justinian, had traveled extensively in North Africa and the Near East, and had experienced a religious conversion that she described as transformative. Justinian fell deeply in love with Theodora, a love that is remarkable precisely because it defied every convention of imperial marriage. By Byzantine law and custom, a man of senatorial rank could not marry an actress. Justinian persuaded his uncle, the emperor, to change the law. He then married Theodora, and upon becoming sole emperor in 527, elevated her to the rank of Augusta, his co-ruler and equal partner in power. The elevation was not merely ceremonial. Justinian issued laws in their joint names. Theodora held court independently, received foreign ambassadors, maintained her own network of political relationships, and exercised genuine authority in matters of policy, patronage, and religious affairs. She was particularly active in the protection of women and girls, issuing legislation that closed brothels, provided refuges for women escaping prostitution, and strengthened legal protections for women in marriage and property matters. The defining moment of Theodora's imperial career came January 532 CE. During Nika Revolt, the most dangerous crisis of Justinian's reign, the hippodrome factions of the Blues and the Greens, normally bitter rivals, united in their anger against government, flooded the streets of Constantinople, burned much of the city, and acclaimed a new emperor. Justinian, surrounded by his advisors in the palace, was on the verge of fleeing by sea. It was Theodora who stopped him. In a speech recorded by Procopius, who was present, she told the assembled court that she would not flee. She would not flee. That purple was the most glorious burial shroud, and that a person who had once worn the imperial crown could not endure to live as an exile. Her resolve stiffened the emperor's nerve. Justinian sent his generals Belisarius and Mundus into the hippodrome, where they massacred approximately 30,000 rioters. The revolt was crushed. The reign continued. Theodora's intervention had saved the empire. The achievements of Justinian's reign are staggering in their scope. He reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, temporarily reuniting much of the old Western Roman Empire under Constantinople's authority. He rebuilt Constantinople itself after the devastation of the Nika Revolt, constructing Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which remains one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history, a building so extraordinary that when Justinian first entered the completed church in 537, he reportedly exclaimed that he had surpassed even Solomon, and he commissioned the greatest legal achievement of the ancient world. Iuris Civilis, the systematic codification of Roman law that became the foundation of legislative systems across Europe and still influences jurisprudence to this day. Beside these achievements, Theodora's hand is visible in the laws protecting women, in the religious policies that reflected her own theological sympathies, in the diplomacy and patronage that she conducted independent authority. The greatest age of Byzantine histories, in the truest sense, a joint reign. Part 4. Empresses alone. Women wo-ruled, Byzantium Irene of Athens, and Zoe Porphyrogenita. The Byzantine Empire, for all its patriarchal assumptions about gender and power, produced something that the medieval West almost never did. Women who ruled as sole monarchs in their own names, not as regents for absent husbands or minor sons, but as autonomous sovereigns. The two most significant of these female autocrats, Irene of Athens and Zoe Porphyrogenita, represent, in very different ways, the extremes of what imperial ambition, like when it resided in a woman's person. Irene was born in Athens around 750 CE and came to Constantinople as a young woman to be the wife of Leo VIII, emperor of the Isaurian dynasty. Leo died in 780, leaving Irene as regent for their 10-year-old son Constantine Caesar. For the next decade, Irene governed the empire in her son's name, navigating the treacherous politics of the Byzantine court with considerable skill. She was a committed supporter of the veneration of icons, the images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints that had been at the center of a bitter theological controversy known as iconoclasm. Her late husband's family had been iconoclast, opposed to icon veneration. Irene reversed this policy, convening the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which formally restored the veneration of icons and established the theological framework that the Orthodox Church has maintained ever since. It was a triumph of both religious policy and personal conviction, but Irene's relationship with her son Constantine CI was deeply troubled. As the boy grew into a young man, tension between mother and son over the control of power became acute. Constantine attempted to assert his independence. Irene maneuvered against him. The conflict oscillated for years through alternating phases of cooperation and confrontation. In 797, Irene made a decision that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of Byzantine political culture. She had her own son arrested, brought to the Porphyra, the purple chamber of the palace, and blinded. Constantine Zi died of his wounds shortly afterward. Irene then ruled as sole emperor, using the masculine title Basilius, rather than the feminine Basilissa, for the next 5 years. She was the first woman in Byzantine history to rule in her own name. Irene's sole reign from 797 to 802 was marked by capable administration and uncontentious religious policies. She reduced, promoted trade, and maintained the external security of the empire with reasonable success. The Pope in Rome, confronted with a female ruler in Constantinople and requiring a rationale for political alliance with the Frankish king Charlemagne, declared that the Roman throne was effectively vacant, since a woman could not truly be emperor, and crowned Charlemagne as emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day 800 CE. This act, which Irene reportedly received with fury and which she reputedly sought countered by proposing a marriage alliance with Charlemagne, was among the most consequential political gestures of the medieval period, initiating the idea of a separate Western Roman Empire that would evolve into the Holy Empire. In 802, a palace conspiracy deposed Irene and sent her into exile, where she died the following year. She was venerated as a saint by the Orthodox Church. Centuries later, another woman who embodied female imperial power in its purest form sat on the Byzantine throne, Zoe Porphyrogenita. Born in the purple, was a daughter of Emperor Constantine the Reader and a granddaughter of the great Basil II, the Boulder Slayer, one of powerful emperors in Byzantine history. Zoe was the living embodiment of legitimate Macedonian dynastic blood. And in the political culture of 11th century Byzantium, that blood was the ultimate source of imperial legitimacy. She was also, by most accounts, a remarkable woman, intensely devoted to the manufacture of perfumes, essences, deeply legit, warm-hearted, and impulsive in her personal relationships, possessed of a vitality that contemporary sources describe as extraordinary even into old age. Zoe's imperial story is one of the strangest in Byzantine history, because she did not accede to the throne until she was approximately 50 years old, having spent most of her life in the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, the palace, effectively held in reserve as dynastic insurance. When her father Constantine Story died in 1028, without a male heir, the dying emperor arranged for Zoe to marry a court official named Romanos Argyros on his death. Romanos became Emperor Romanus III the following day, when he died, drowned in his bath, in suspicious circumstances in 1034. Zoe married a young man named Michael within hours, making him Emperor Michael IV. When Michael IV died in 1041, Zoe briefly shared power with her adopted son Michael V, who repaid her maternal generosity by exiling her to a monastery on an island in the Sea of Marmora. The people of Constantinople rose in revolt, stormed the monastery, brought Zoe back to the city in triumph. Michael V was blinded and exiled. Zoe then co-ruled with her sister Theodora before marrying for the third time, taking a court official named Constantine Monomachus as Emperor Constantine's ex. She died in 1050, still nominally Empress of Byzantium at an age estimated to be around 72. Her face, along with those of her husband Constantine Alex, stares out from the mosaics of the Hagia Sophia to this day, a permanent image of a woman who, through sheer virtue of her blood, remained the center of Byzantine legitimacy across more than 2 decades of political turbulence. Part 5: Love, Dynasty, and Polypolitical Marriage, the mechanics of imperial unions. To understand the marriages of Byzantine emperors, one must first abandon most misconceptions at what marriage was for. In the Byzantine imperial context, marriage was primarily a political instrument, a mechanism for establishing alliances, consolidating dynasties, producing heirs, and managing the complex web of aristocratic ambitions that surrounded the throne. Love, when it existed in an imperial marriage, was a bonus, sometimes a profound one, as in the case of Justinian and Theodora. But it was never the primary consideration, and it was always liable to be overridden by political necessity. The selection of imperial bride was a formal process that could involve what Byzantine sources call a bride show. A systematic search across the empire for suitable candidates. Young women of appropriate birth, beauty, and character were identified in the provinces and brought to Constantinople for evaluation. The process was not entirely on the lay, unlike a modern talent competition, and it was taken with great seriousness. Several emperors found their wives through this mechanism, include Theophilos, who ruled from 829 to 840 to 42 CE, and who chose his host, Empress Theodora, the restorer of icon veneration after the second period of iconoclasm, from among the candidates assembled for his inspection. The bride show was both a practical procedure and a statement of imperial ideology. The best woman in all the empire, regardless of social origin, was worthy to be impressed. In practice, of course, political considerations always shape the outcome. But the formal commitment to finding the most excellent gave the process a legitimizing quality. Foreign princesses were also regular candidates for imperial marriage, though Byzantine cultural pride created a tension in these arrangements. The Byzantines considered themselves the direct heirs of Rome and the most civilized people on earth, and the idea of a foreigner on the sacred throne could be uncomfortable. Nevertheless, political necessity, the need to forge alliances with neighboring powers, to neutralize threats, or to signal diplomatic relationships, regularly overcame cultural squeamishness. The Rus, the Ligurians, the Germans, and others all sent princesses to Constantinople at various points in Byzantine history. When Vladimir, the Grand Prince of Kiev, was baptized into tune to Orthodox Christianity around 988 and received the hand of then to Princenin Anna Porphyrogenita as his bride, the marriage was simultaneously a diplomatic triumph for Byzantium and a transformative cultural event for the Rus, initiating Orthodox Christianization of what would become Russia. The fate of empresses who fell from favor illustrates the extreme vulnerability that accompanied the extreme elevation of imperial status. The monastery was the Byzantine equivalent of the prison for disgraced members of the imperial family. An empress who had lost her husband's favor, or's husband had died, and whose continued presence at court was politically inconvenient, or who was implicated in conspiracy, was liable to be tonsured, that is, to have her hair cut as a symbol of her adoption of religious life, and dispatched to a convent, often on an island or in a remote location. Once a woman had taken holy orders, she was theoretically removed from political life forever. Though in practice determined women sometimes found ways to re-emerge. The Empress Euphrosyne, wife of Michael II, was placed in a monastery after his death in 829, only for her stepson Theophilos to bring her back to the court, untonsured, to manage the bride show from which he chose his own wife. The boundaries between sacred and secular between retirement and return were always negotiable in the Byzantine world. Some imperial marriages were distinguished by genuine partnership and mutual devotion. The relationship between Emperor John II Komnenos, who ruled from 118 to 143, and his Hungarian-born Empress Irene, given the Greek name Irene on her marriage, her original Hungarian name being Pyroska, was by all accounts a deeply affectionate one. Irene accompanied John on his military campaigns, shared his commitment to the reform and strengthening Byzantine institutions, and collaborated with him in founding the Pantocrator Monastery in Constantinople, a complex that included not only a church of remarkable beauty, but also a hospital, with specialized wards for different types of patients, a home for the elderly, and a medical school. The Typicon, or Foundation Charter, of the Pantocrator is one of the most detailed documents of Byzantine social welfare, and reveals couple who share intellectual and spiritual values, as well as political partnership. Irene died in 1134, predeceasing her husband by nearly a decade, and was venerated as a saint. John reportedly never recovered from her loss. Part 6. The emperors and their consorts, Basil II, Nikaro's focus, and the age of military expansion. The 10th century was the age of the soldier emperors, men who rebuilt Byzantine military power after decades of weakness and defensive warfare, who pushed the frontiers of the empire outward on every side, and who restored Byzantium to a position of dominance in the Near East that it had not held since the great days of Justinian. These were men whom the battlefield was more familiar than the ceremonial hall, and their relationships with imperial power and with the women in their lives reflected that orientation. Nikephoros Phocas, who ruled from 963 to 969 CE, was one of the most militarily successful emperors in Byzantine history. A brilliant general from the greatest military families of Anatolia, he had reconquered Cilicia and parts of Syria, retaken the island of Crete from Arab pirates, and inflicted repeated defeats on the armies of the Muslim powers to the east. When the child emperor Hermannosigeras died in 963, leaving a widow and 2 young sons, Nikephoros used his military prestige and the loyalty of his troops to seize the throne. He then made a decision that caused scandal in Constantinople. He married the widow of the dead emperor. Her name was Theophano. Theophano was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful and politically formidable. Her origins were obscure. She was reportedly the daughter of a tavern keeper, a background that echoed the unlikely rise of Theodora 4 centuries earlier. But she had been married to Romanos Scipio, had borne him children who now carried the sacred purple blood of the Macedonian dynasty, and was widely regarded as one of the most dangerous people in Constantinople. Her marriage to Nikephoros was politically useful for both parties. He gained dynastic legitimacy through connection to the Macedonian line. She gained continued access to power and protection for her sons. Whether there was genuine feeling between them is uncertain. What is certain is that Theophano, apparently tired of the rough-mannered, ascetic, and battle-hardened emperor, eventually conspired with her lover John Simotskus, another brilliant general, to have of Nikephoros murdered in December 969. Assassins admitted to the imperial bedchamber killed the sleeping emperor. John Simotskus became Emperor John I. He then exiled Theophano to a monastery, having no further use. For once she had served her purpose. She had miscalculated the degree to which her usefulness would survive the murder. Basil II Huzu, who ruled from 976 to Constantine 25 CE, and is considered by many historians the greatest of all Byzantine emperors, presents one of the most intriguing personal puzzles in Byzantine history. He never married, he never produced an heir. He devoted himself with almost monastic single-mindedness to the military and administrative tasks of imperial governance, living simply, dressing without ostentation, eating plain food, and spending his reign in a relentless campaign to expand Byzantine power. He destroyed the Bulgarian Empire so completely that the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel reportedly died of a stroke when he saw the 10,000 brune soldiers whom Basil had returned to him after the Battle of Cleidion. Basil had blinded 99 men out of every 100 and left the 100th with one eye to lead the rest home. It was an act of calculated psychological terror that earned him the epithet Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer. Basil's failure and produce it was the great dynastic weakness of his otherwise overwhelming reign. His brother and successor Constantine Mthuriru was an ineffective ruler who survived him by only 3 years. And it was left to Constantine's daughters, among them Zoe, whose story we have already told, to manage the dynastic succession as best they could. The empire that Basil had spent 50 years building and expanding was dissipated within a generation by the dynastic instability his own choices had created. It is one of the great ironies of Byzantine history. The emperor, who was perhaps the most complete embodiment of imperial power in the empire's entire history, left no provision for its continuity. Parts of the Komnenian dynasty, empire, Ana Komnen, and the politics of the Purple Chamber when the Komnenian dynasty came to power in 1081 under Alexios I Komnenos. It brought with it a conception of imperial governance that was new in Byzantine history. The idea of the empire as an extended family enterprise, with the emperor at its center, but members of the imperial clan deployed throughout the administration, the military, and the aristocratic hierarchy as the fundamental units of reliable governance. The result was a remarkably stable dynasty that lasted from Lenfend 81 to Woman 85 to 185 and produced some of the most distinctives and personalities in Byzantine history, including, uniquely, a woman who ruled one of the most important historical works of the medieval world. Ana Komnenen was born in 1083, the eldest child of Emperor Alexios I, his Empress Irene Ducana. She was educated with extraordinarily thoroughness in philosophy, history, rhetoric, mathematics, and medicine. in a manner that was unusual even for Byzantine aristocratic women, who were generally better educated than their Western contemporaries, but rarely to the depth that Anna achieved. She was betrothed in childhood to Constantine Ducas, the son of a previous emperor, who was raised in the palace as the presumptive heir. When Alexios I had a son, the future John II, the political calculation shifted. Constantine Ducas died without having married Anna, and she was instead given to Nikephoros Bryennios, a nobleman and historian, in a marriage that was apparently a happy one. Anna, this is the plainest way to state a fact that she herself acknowledged with unusual candor. When her father Alexios I lay dying in London 18, Anna and her mother Irene conspired to have the succession root erected from John, the Mallet to Anna's husband Nikephoros. The conspiracy failed. John II seized the imperial ring from his dying father's finger and rode through Constantinople to secure the loyalty of the palace guard. Anna's mother accepted the outcome. Anna, by her own account, could not. She allegedly organized a further plot against her brother's life that was betrayed to John. The emperor's response was relatively merciful by Byzantine standards. He confiscated Anna's estates rather than blinding or executing her, and sent her into retirement. In that retirement, Anna Komnene wrote the Alexiad, a history of her father's reign that is one of the most remarkable documents of the medieval period. Written in the high literary Greek of the classical tradition, the Alexiad is simultaneously a work of genuine historical scholarship and a personal act of grief and aspiration, the lament of a woman who believed herself capable of ruling an empire and who was denied the chance. Her portrait of Alexios I is admiring but not uncritical. Her portrait of her mother, Empress Irene, is one of the most vivid depictions of a Byzantine empress in any medieval source, and her observations on the crusaders who passed through Constantinople during the First Crusade, those armed and often barbaric Western warriors whose arrival transformed the politics of the Near East, are among the most perceptive contemporary assessments of that extraordinary event. Anna died around 153. After the reign of the father she had celebrated and the brother she had never forgiven. Her book survives. In it, she achieved the permanence that political power never gave her. The Komnenian emperors maintained their dynasty through strategic marriage on a scale that previous Byzantine dynasties had never attempted. Alexios I married his children and grandchildren to members of every significant aristocratic family in the empire, creating a web of dynastic connection that bound the military and administrative elite to the imperial family through ties of blood and marriage. The Empress Irene Dukaina, Anna's mother, was a formidable partner in this enterprise, managing the family networks with the attention to detail and the patience for complexity that the strategy required. She was also, a woman of genuine piety and intellectual interests, who founded the founding of a monastery near Constantinople, where she eventually retired. The collaboration between Alexios and Irene, not without tensions, but sustained and productive, exemplified best of what Byzantine imperial-imperial partnership could achieve. Part Yite. The Fourth Crusade and the fragmentation of power, empire shattered. Empresses in exile in the spring of 224. Something happened that the Byzantines had never imagined possible. Constantinople fell, not to the Muslims, against whom the empire had struggled for 6 centuries, but to fellow Christians, the Knights of the Fourth Crusade, who had set out ostensibly to recapture Jerusalem and who, through a combination of debt, opportunism, and the manipulation of Byzantine dynastic politic, found themselves instead besieging and then sacking the Queen of Cities. For 3 days, Crusaders' soldiers looted Constantinople with systematic ferocity, stealing the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years, breaking open tombs, melting down sacred objects for their precious metals, shipping irreplaceable relics and artworks back to Venice and the courts of Western Europe. The great city on the Bosporus, the richest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, was reduced to a plundered shadow of itself. The immediate cause of loss of the disaster was the instability of the late Byzantine court, a succession of weak emperors, dynastic coups, political miscalculations had Constantinople vulnerable in ways that previous generations of Byzantines would have found inconceivable. The Empress Euphrosyne, wife of Emperor Alexios III, who had seized the throne in 1195 in maligning and deposing and blinding his own brother, was a woman of considerable political intelligence who tried to manage the gathering crisis with insufficient tools. When the Crusader fleet appeared off Constantinople and a rival claimant was presented to the city, Euphrosyne reportedly advised her husband to stand and fight. He fled instead, abandoning the city. She was captured and eventually released, living out her years in exile. The women of the imperial family who survived the fall of 2 and 4 had 4 scattered across the fragments of what had been the empire, carrying the Byzantine dynastic tradition exile. The Latin Empire that the Crusaders established in Constantinople lasted only 57 years, from 104 to 154 to 261, but the Byzantine successor states that formed in Dial, the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, that the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, maintained Byzantine imperial traditions, Byzantine court culture, and Byzantine claims to the throne of Constantinople. The women of the imperial Lascarides family in Nicaea played crucial roles in sustaining these claims. Empress Irene Lascarina, wife of Emperor Theodore I Lascarides, was instrumental in the governance of the Nicaean state during a period external military pressure from multiple directions. Her daughter-in-law, Theodora Lascarina, showed similar qualities. The Nicaean Empire was, in many ways, a more administratively efficient and economically viable state than the late Constantinople. It replaced a strange silver lining to catastrophe. The restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople in 1261, achieved by Emperor Baz Torr Palaiologos, who recaptured the city from the weakened Latin Empire, brought the imperial tradition back to its ancient seat. But the Constantinople Michael recovered was a diminished city, depopulated, physically damaged, economically hollowed out. The century and a half that remained before the final fall of the city in 1453 was a period of slow decline, punctuated by civil wars, external pressures from the rising Zheng Ottoman state and other powers, and the gradual contraction of the empire's territorial base. It was also, paradoxically, a period of cultural brilliance, the Paleologan Renaissance, in which Byzantine art, theology, and philosophy reached new heights of sophistication, even as the political and military situation darkened. Partnaya, the last dynasty, the Paleologos sunset of the Byzantine world. The Palaiologos dynasty, which ruled Constantinople from 261 until the very end in 453, was a family of an only of considerable intellectual and personal distinction ruling an empire that was visibly dying. The last 2 centuries of Byzantine history are marked by a peculiar intensity, a civilization that knew its time was running out, producing art of extraordinary beauty, theology, proof of profound sophistication, and diplomatic maneuvers of desperate ingenuity. Even as the Ottoman Turks closed in on 3 sides and the Western powers on whom Constantinople had pinned its hopes for military assistance, attached conditions to their help that the Orthodox Church could not accept. Among the Paleologan empresses, Helena Dragasis stands at the historical edge, the last empress of Byzantium in the full sense of the term. She was the daughter of a Serbian-Bulgarian nobleman, Constantine Dragas, and she married Emperor Manueliogo Palaiologos around 1392, becoming empress during one of the most precarious periods of Byzantine history. Manuel II was a man of extraordinary quality, a scholar and theologian, as well as competent soldier and diplomat, who spent years traveling through the courts of Western Europe seeking military assistance against the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I. Helena governed in Constantinople during his absence, managing the affairs of a city, was being slowly strangled by Ottoman encirclement. When Manuel returned, husband and collaborated in the governance of a state to the state, reduced the city itself and a few islands and coastal enclaves. Hileld, her husband, who died in 125 and survived to see the final catastrophe. Her son, Johnny Dur, reigned from 125 to 448, and his Moria of Trebizond was a woman of beauty and personal warmth, who died young without children. John's next empress, Sophia of Montferrat, was found so physically unappealing by the Byzantines. Sources describe her with the cruelty that Byzantine court culture could deploy against outsiders, that she returned to the West within a year of her marriage. John Donne died childless in 448. His brother Constantine, who became the last emperor, Constantine the Disease Palaiologos, was a widower who sought a new bride in the final years before the Ottoman siege, but never remarried. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 453. was one of the decisive events of world history, the moment that medieval historians, and Renaissance humanists alike recognized as the end of an era. The Ottoman Sultan Süleyman Mehmed II, 21 years old, and already one of the most capable military commanders in the world, had besieged the city with an army vastly larger than its defenders and with artillery that could break walls no previous attacker had been able to breach. Constantine Z. Palaiologos died in the final fighting. Whether killed in battle or disappeared in the chaos, no body was definitively identified. He died as lean as he had lived, a man of courage and dignity in an impossible situation. The imperial purple ended in blood and fire on the walls of the city that Constantine had founded more than 1100 years before. Helena Dragas, the last Empress Dowager, had retired to a monastery before the fall. She died in 450, 3 years before the end, spared the final catastrophe. The women of the Palaiologos family who survived vor on 453p scattered, as their predecessors scattered Dardarant to Madu 4. Into exile, into marriages with the marriages, into Western or Eastern rulers, carrying with them the names, the claims, and the memories of a civilization that had endured for more than 1,000 years. Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last emperor, married Ivan XXX of Moscow in 472, and Thu, that merit the idea of Moscow as the third Rome, the inheritor of Constantinople's sacred role, entered Russian political consciousness, where it would remain for centuries. Part 10. The Sacred and the Human. Faith, icon, imperial, women, religious of Byzantine empresses. One of the most distinctive fifth features of Byzantine imperial culture was the degree to which religious faith was not merely a public performance, but a genuine personal commitment, sometimes a passionate and even dangerous one. Byzantine theology was not an abstraction, it was a living argument, conducted with intensity and sometimes violence, about the nature of Christ, the role of images in worship, the relationship between human and divine, and the proper ordering of the Christian life. Emperors and empresses were not observers of these debates. They were participants, protagonists, and sometimes casualties. The iconoclastic controversy divided the church and state for more than a century across two periods, roughly 76 from 887 CE and 87 CE, 8057 CT, and 815 to 840-43 CC. Placed several empresses at its very center. The veneration of icons, the painted or mosaic images of Christ, and the saints that filled Byzantine churches and private homes had been declared idolatry by the Emperor Leo XXX in 726. The theological and political arguments for and against iconoclasm were complex, but that the human consequences were stark. Monks and clergy who refused to give up their icons were imprisoned, tortured, mutilated, and killed. Artworks of irreplaceable beauty were destroyed. It was an empress who finally ended the second period of iconoclasm and restored icon veneration permanently. The Empress Theodora, wife of the iconoclast Emperor Theophilos, had secretly maintained her devotion to icons throughout her husband's reign, reportedly hiding small images in her private chambers. When Theophilos died in 842, leaving Theodora as regent for their infant son Michael III, she moved quickly to restore icon veneration, convening a church council that formally re-established the practice in March 843. The day of that restoration, the first Sunday of Lent, is still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. One of the most significant dates in Orthodox Christian theology, Theodora is venerated as a saint, and her image appears in the liturgical art of Orthodox churches around the world. She achieved what no emperor had been willing to risk. The monastery was the great alternative to the palace in the lives of Byzantine imperial women. Some went there unwillingly, pushed by political adversaries, exiled by husbands or sons who found them inconvenient. But others went with genuine religious commitment, seeing in the monastic life of freedom and a dignity that the palace, with all its luxury and danger, could not provide. Empress Irene Doukaina, the mother of Anna Komnene, retired to the monastery she had founded near Constantinople. What her daughter described genuine relief. The Emperor Alexios I, her husband, reportedly offered to take her back to court after a period of separation. She declined. The monastery offered prayer, scholarship, community, and an authority within its own walls that was not subject to the vicissitudes of court politics. For women who had lived their lives at the center of the most dangerous political environment in the medieval world, it was not an unwelcome destination. The relationship between Byzantine imperial women and the church was not one-sided. Empresses were major patrons of religious art and architecture, commissioning churches, monasteries, reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts that survive as some of the greatest masterpieces of Byzantine visual culture. The embroideries and textile works produced under imperial patronage, many of them depicting sacred subjects with extraordinary technical refinement, represent a category of artistic production in women's hands, and women's patronage were decisive. The silver reliquary, the embroidered altar cloth, the gilded icon cover, these objects were often created for imperial or in women, and they carried the sacred authority of their patrons into the liturgical life of the church. To be empress in Byzantium was, among other things, to be a shaper of the visual and material culture of Christianity itself. Part 11. Legacy. What Byzantium left behind, closing reflections on empire, women, and memory. On the morning of May 29th, 453, as the Ottoman army poured through the breached walls of Constantinople, and the last emperor fell in the fighting, 1,000 years of continuous imperial tradition came to an end. The city did not disappear. It became Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and continued to be one of the great cities of the world. The Hagia Sophia, which Justinian and Theodora had built as a Christian church, became a mosque. The mosaics of Christ and the Virgin and the imperial couples were plastered over, hidden for centuries. But they were not destroyed. When the plaster was eventually removed in the 20th century, the faces looked out unchanged. Zoe Porphyrogenita, beside her third husband, the Emperor John II of Komnenos, with his Empress Irene, Christ Pantocrator in the dome above them all. What did Byzantium leave to the world? The answer is more than most people realize. Byzantine law, grounded in the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and continues to influence legal traditions from Scotland to South Africa. The Orthodox Christianity that Byzantine missionaries carried to Slavic peoples, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Rus, remains of hundreds of millions of people in Russia, Ukraine, Greece, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and beyond. Byzantine art, with its formal hieratic beauty and its mastery, icon, and illumination, shaped the visual tradition of the Orthodox world and influenced the art Renaissance Italy, through the Imig Greek scholars and artists who carried Byzantine learning westward after 14453. The very idea of a Christian civilization, of a state that understood itself as operating under divine governance, and that integrated religious and political authority in a single imperial person, is a Byzantine legacy the medieval West absorbed and transformed in its own way. The Impresses of Byzantium left their own particular legacy, one that is only now reaping the scholarly attention it deserves. Women like Theodora, who saved an empire like Irene, who convened a church council and blinded her own son, like Zoe, who married and remained the center of legitimacy through it all, like Lena Komnen, who wrote one of the great histories of the medieval world, like Helena, who found relics and built churches and became a saint. These women operated in a system that was formally patriarchal, but that created, in practice, more space for female power than almost any other medieval political system. They did not achieve this through feminism as we would understand it. They achieved it through intelligence, through this T3 of dynastic legitimacy, through religious conviction, through the willingness to take extraordinary risks, and through particular vulnerability of a system in which the succession was always uncertain and capable people, regardless of gender, found themselves needed. The story of the Byzantine emperors and their wives is ultimately a story about what it means to hold power in a civilization that believed power came from God. When things went well, that belief provided stability, legitimacy, and a shared framework of meaning. When things went badly, when emperors were deposed, blinded, murdered, when empresses were exiled, tonsured, the belief that God's will was somehow present in these events required acts of theological creativity that the Byzantines performed with remarkable ingenuity. They were a people who could hold in their minds simultaneously the grandeur of divine providence and the brutal contingency of human event, who produced, from that tension, a civilization of extraordinary richness complexity. Constantinople fell. The mosaics survived. The law code survived. The icon survived. The theological tradition survived. the stories survived, and the descendants of the people who built that civilization in Greece, in Russia, in Serbia, in Romania, in the Orthodox communities that ring the globe, still carry something of that inheritance in their religious life. Their traditions and their sense of historical identity. 1,000 years of empire does not disappear when its last emperor falls on its walls. It transforms, disperses, and continues informs its makers could not have anticipated. That, perhaps, is the most Byzantine thing about Byzantium. It knew how to endure,